talking about the results from the Ultra Short Throw Projector Showdown, which was held November 8th, 2025, at the projectorscreen.com headquarters in New Jersey, where 8 of the top Ultra Short Throw, aka UST projectors, faced off side by side with tests across 15 different categories that I think lasted a staggering 9 hours. But before we find out who won and what happened, I'd like to welcome our panel. And first up, we have the organizer of the event and the owner of projectorscreen.com, Brian Gluck. Hey, Brian.
What's going on, Brian? Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we have the MC of the event, a familiar face, and you may recognize him from our last podcast. This is Phil Jones, who runs projectorreviews.com when he's off duty from his day job at Harman International. Welcome, Phil.
How are you? Hey, Brian. Hey, Chris. Chris, long time no see.
Yeah,
Oh my
miss you,
gosh, it's
Chris.
been days, man. It's been days.
And of course, we have our editor at large, Chris Boylan, who was one of 6 judges at this year's showdown. Hey, Chris.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
All right. Now, to start us off, and for people that have no idea what a UST projector is, because it is somewhat of a relatively new category, who wants to make the case for why a UST projector, why not a regular projector, or why not just an extra big TV?
Sure. Well, I'll step into that one right here, right? So, obviously TVs are getting bigger and cheaper, right? But, you're still bringing in a giant rectangle, right? So, in a lot of places, you're unable to get a flat panel of that size, in an elevator or through doorways. Whereas if you're going with a ultra short throw and a projector screen, it's the screen is assembled on site. You have a package that is easily transportable, something that could be disassembled and moved as well, and even more so retractable, right? So as opposed to having a giant 85 to 100-inch gray rectangle, looming over your living environment, you can make it disappear with a retractable screen and have your windows there, have your artwork, or even have a smaller TV behind it, for when you want the inferior experience of a small TV over over a projector screen.
Yeah, that's funny.
And then in the case against, traditional projection, I mean, there's not one necessarily better than the other. Ultra short throw does have some installation simplicity, right? You pop it right on a credenza, right up against, the screen, you know, inches away from it. So there's not a lot of complicated wiring or integration necessary. A lot of them have onboard apps for those that, prefer not to use an external streaming device. And some of them, and the majority of them have audio to varying degrees of quality and how that may provide you a cinematic experience or not. But really, I think where ultra short throw is more commonly adopted is in environments with higher levels of ambient light. Ultra short throw ambient light rejecting screens are generally less expensive than their standard throw counterparts and introduce less artifacts such as laser speckle and other things. And but there's also ultra short throws that are going in dedicated cinema rooms, and we've seen some items in this showdown and in previous years that really excel in darkroom performance and provide a wider color gamut than you can get with many other projectors because most of the USTs are triple laser. Um, and just a nice, easy experience.
Phil, do you have anything to add?
No, he basically covered it all because the goal is just to bigger picture, a more immersive image just pulls you more into the action, right? Why measure your TV in inches when you can measure it in feet? Right. I could easily have dual six. You like football games? I could have dual 485s. Right. And then when I hit a switch with one of Brian's screens and make it disappear, there's advantages to it. We're not saying that projectors are the only way. We're just saying that it is an application for many people should maybe consider, especially if they're looking for a very, very, very large immersive image.
Yeah, and that was one thing I talked about getting 100-inch into your room, but these ultra short throw projectors are supporting 150 inches plus, right? And there are 150-inch retractable as well as fixed frame ambient light rejecting screens for these. So literally, you can have as large of a screen as you have a tall of a ceiling, essentially at this point.
And Chris, any thoughts?
No, I think they covered it. You can make a UST completely disappear when it's not in use, and that's something that a lot of people who care about what their living room looks like care about, right? Because when you're
Yeah.
watching the TV, it's massive, and press a button, the screen disappears.
Right.
In some cases, the projector itself can be kind of hidden in a credenza,
Mhm.
and you wouldn't even know there's a TV there at all. I mean, you get
Mhm.
one approach with Samsung, and they've got their artwork TV that turns into art when it's off, but this completely disappears, and that's even better.
Mhm.
So I
Right.
think, as these guys said, if you're going over 120 inches, particularly, or even anything over 100 inches, the value proposition of a UST projector is hard to
Mhm.
beat.
All right. Well, none of you mentioned, I was kind of surprised that you didn't mention this. It's one of my pet peeves is glare. And if you have
Yes.
a projector, it eliminates all glare
Mhm.
and you have I think you have a greater cinematic experience
Mhm.
than from flat panel TVs.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I'm just curious, just to kind of get your thoughts on the glare issue and why that doesn't seem to come up because you guys kind of overlooked it, but I think
Yeah,
it's
that's
pretty cool.
it is cool that there's no glare. The other one too is the projector manufacturers are working on making the light more relaxing. They talk about the fact you
Mm,
grab your smartphone and that blue light blasts you and you can't go to sleep. So a lot of times companies look, there's a lot of companies that are working on things like reducing that blue light that keeps you up. So it's a
mm,
more relaxing experience. Not only does the movie look cinematic like it should, the
right.
director developed it to go on to be on this type of screen. It's also when it's time to go to bed, it's a lot easier to go to bed after instead of getting blasted by 100-inch, flat panel
Right.
television set before you go to sleep.
I'd jump in with one thing, and I think it was either JVC or Epson that mentioned that projectors are sort of more a natural way of viewing things.
Oh yeah.
Like when I'm looking at Phil, I'm not looking at Phil. I'm looking at the light reflecting off of Phil. Right, that's
Exactly.
what makes it look like Phil. And you're looking great today, by the way, Phil. But a projector does the same thing. It reflects light off a surface, and that can be, as Phil stated, like a more relaxing experience than having everything glowing. Not that I don't love OLED TVs, I do, but people don't glow. Light does. So
Yes.
in a projection system where the light is reflecting off of objects, it could be a more natural way of viewing things.
All right. Well, let's talk about this showdown because there were 8 projectors. Um, let's talk about. I know there were 3 from Hisense. We have some brands you might not have heard of: Nexigo, XJimmy, JMGO. Um, did I miss any?
Four
Epson,
movie
Epson's there,
Epson.
yeah.
4
Yeah.
Or
movie.
movie.
Mhm.
And then, so within that, there were some brands left out. I know BenQ wasn't in, Samsung wasn't in,
Okay.
and AWOL are the
Okay. So
kind of the
let's
3
yeah.
that come to mind.
Okay, so I'll talk about a couple of reasons. Like Brian and I had to struggle with this because there are a lot more ultra short throw projectors on the market. What we wanted to do was look at the ones that people were most inquisitive about. Okay, so the first thing, how does everything compare against last year's winner? Hence the PX3-PRO being in there. I heard about this super projector from from Hisense. Well, the L9Q comes in. Wow, and then it's like, well, what, so you end up with, well, so we tried to look at the best combination. There are some other projectors out, but many of them are a couple of years old, right? So we wanted to grab some of the newer models that we knew were going to be in lineups for a little while longer. We wanted to grab the ones that were getting the most buzz on the internet. Um, you'll notice that Hisense has more. It's just because they're the leader. They have more to offer at a what, and people want to know what does the value one look like, and what does the flagship look like. So we were trying to just do 2, but we realized that we had to put all 3 in, and you'll see that each one really hits a value proposition. The Epson, same thing. It's the only. Of course, you got to include. It's pretty much the only 3 LCD um, ultra short throw projector on the market, and its brightness is outrageous. And that's its claim to fame. So we really tried to look at the how many projectors we could bring, and then which ones were going to be the best solution, the best options that people were inquisitive about. There was one that you're not seeing on the scorecard that I will let Brian kind of talk about. That's a very popular piece because everybody's going to say, why is that one not there? But there's a reason. We love it, but there's a reason why it's not included. So Brian, you want to cover that one?
Yeah, sure. So the unfortunate casualty of the event was the Nexigo Aurora 2 Pro, or the Nexigo Aurora Pro Mark II. That's the latest projector from Nexigo. Nexigo had been in previous, showdowns with us in the past, and they're really well known for their darkroom performance, right? So they are the only USC in the bunch that has a dynamic iris. They have really great, laser dimming, good HDR algorithms to handle, shadow detail, and it's a good value product and a strong performer, and it's very popular online with, a devout following on AVS forum, and other places. And unfortunately, at like 6:30 on Friday, as we were, finalizing all of the setup, we had a technical issue with the unit that we had already configured, with Nexigo settings, and we kind of scrambled to find another one. So we grabbed another one off of the shelf after notifying Nexigo, and updated the firmware to the latest version, and set it up, and everything looked good, and went to bed for the night, and prepare for the next morning. And during the event, there was several people that were familiar with the product, and we were all kind of wondering, why it wasn't living up to how we recalled it to look or what we expected in a lot of areas. And I think it was chalked up by the judges and by Phil maybe. I'm kind of a fly on the wall, but chalked up that was just the settings that Nexigo chose, right? And I think we'll get a little bit more into how these things were set up later to give a little bit of better context. And it wasn't until the lunch break happened when we started to do the out of the box testing where the item kind of like came to life. And then, the following day, Phil and I were looking at the scores and, just kind of in disbelief about, what we were analyzing with the data in regards to it. And, you know, instead of working on our own videos and write-ups, we spent a couple hours like digging into it, trying to figure out like what was going on. And after speaking with Nexigo and, some of the judges and other people, Nexigo kind of said that when you make the leap from the original firmware version that was loaded on the unit directly to the latest OTA, hard factory reset may be required in order for the settings that were made available in the menus to like actually kick in and function properly. And we were not aware of that. The unit that we had previous, we've been demonstrating it for about a month or two in the office, and it's gone through its traditional rollout, I guess, of firmware updates. But this latest one over the air was very recent, and Nexigo said they used to have a message or a prompt at the firmware update screen to factory reset afterwards, but they removed it for this one. And it's just an
Wonderful.
unfortunate perfect
Yeah.
storm of
Yeah.
blowing up at the last minute, and getting a
Yeah.
replacement up there and not
Yeah.
being informed that there was a special treatment that we needed to do. And
Yeah.
Right.
just putting it out there that generally you don't always have to factory reset after firmware updates. Some
Mhm.
manufacturers do suggest it, but it also wipes out all of your settings,
Mhm.
right? So if you're a user at home and you get an OTA firmware update, you don't necessarily need to do that factory reset, but if you
Yeah.
calibrate your projector,
Yeah.
keep track of what all of those settings are. So for
Exactly.
that update,
Yeah.
you can get it right
Exactly.
back. So
So
Yeah.
when we
um,
talk about that projector, by the way, it didn't impact all of the things, but it impacted one of its major strengths, which the ability to extract shadow detail, deliver deep black levels, and extract shadow detail. Now, all the other things it did fine in, but if you take one of its primary strengths and it's not as strong as it would be, that also impacts the judge. We think it would probably impact the judge's overall perception when we get into value and things like that. So the only way we looked at, do we just take sections out? Do we just remove it from that section? But it actually impacted the whole judge's perspective. So just after talking with everybody, we decided it was fair not to have it on there. I will tell you, I've reviewed it. I think if you'll see my reviews. It's won a lot, and if you look at a lot of other people, it's won a lot. We wish we could have included it, but it just happened. Now, there's one more thing that I want to talk about before we get into. I want to talk real quickly about why we do this. I see every single one of these projectors, but I see them all as an isolated thing as a reviewer, or even and each time I see one, they look great, right? The black levels look great, but now I'm relying on my memory and a spec sheet to determine which one's better. If I grab a pair of great speakers that have the same frequency response, they do not sound the same, right? I could grab a speaker that has worse bass response on paper, but in a room, it'll have better bass response. The specs are just a potential, right? But what separates a projector is how the manufacturer utilizes the full potential of the product with contrast curves, color mapping, tone mapping. So you can't just look at the specs, right? And being able to put them all together, which is a very rare situation, means that you can truly see how each one interacts. And when the judges walked in, they all said, "Oh my God, this is going to be really hard," because they were all good. They just all had strengths and
That's true.
weaknesses, and they all worked at different applications.
Cool.
Yeah.
And Brian, I just want to mention one other thing here. In regards to the units that we use, every single model that was included in here was a retail model taken out of the box, right? So, and updated with the actual OTA firmwares or production firmware. So there's no manufacturer selected golden samples that they, juiced up and, or chose out of 50 and gave us the best performing. There's no
Yeah.
beta firmwares. There's no service menu options, right? This is really representative of what any consumer, regardless of where they purchase it from, hopefully from us, but regardless of where they get it from and they crack it out of the box, they have the same chance of having the same level of performance as the unit that we entered in the showdown, which is different than a lot of reviewers, right? That manufacturers send them to, and um, you're assuming they're picking the best of the bunch, before they put it in front of other
They
people's
don't
Right.
do that.
So a lot of complexities in setting this up. These were side by side in a room, and I think there was a reference monitor. Who wants to point out how the
OLED.
reference monitor was set up?
Yeah.
It was the Samsung S90F. It was the 55-inch QD OLED, and that was used, for initially as we were, working on the white balances and stuff like that, but also to provide a reference and under Phil's direction to the judges. And a lot of the criterion is, which projector was most faithful reproduction, to what the intent of the content was as shown on the OLED.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason
Yeah.
why we said the intent of the creator is that when they master this content, like if you go to a movie theater and you look at an image projected on a projector in a movie theater, that is a file that was made specifically for the movie theater. As a consumer, you don't get that file. The file that you get is the one that was mastered specifically for a flat panel display, right? So the creator's intent is to take advantage of the full brightness range of a flat panel display, how it displays highlight details, the brightness of that display, the all of those things. So a projector does not have the capabilities to do that. That's what tone mapping is. It's bending the curve to try to give you as much of the impression of the creator's intent as possible. There is no accurate way to tone map. It is you bending the curve to make it look the best way you can. And each manufacturer chooses a different path to get there. But the goal is to get as close to that OLED as that flat panel as I possibly can, utilizing the capabilities of a projected display with the brightness that it possesses. So that's what we wanted to have that there to say, this is what this is supposed to look like, But that's why we used it as a reference.
And then, so there were 4 different categories which a UST projector could win. It was best mixed use in a bright and dark room, best for home theater, best value, and best overall picture performance. So every projector was given a chance to show its strengths. And as we start to look through this, I think a lot of people are going to look at best value and go, why do I need to spend more if I can just get the best value and get 99% close to what the top model gets for less money? Who wants to talk about who won best value?
Okay, well, I'll let him do the voice. But before we even get into best value, think of best value as a great Subaru WRX for a sports car fan, right? That is a great value, but it's not a Ferrari. Okay, it's not a 911, right? Eventually, yes, you end up with diminishing returns with anything when you talk about performance, right? And to get that extra bit that becomes noticeable, whether it's a car, whether it's a speaker, whether it's a display, the cost starts to jump, right? And so yes, there's value, but you do get what you pay for if you invest in a flagship model. So go ahead, Brian. Talk about the value guide.
Yeah, Brian, could you actually pull up the beginning of the scorecard where it shows like the rankings and the awards? Because all right, cool. So one of the things I'm going to point out is, when you looked at the larger scorecard is, you have all of these different criteria like SDR, color accuracy, shadow detail, bright room viewing, HDR, general performance, right? So to give a little context to everyone that's watching is like the judges were instructed to grade each projector on all of these different criterions according to the content that Phil was displaying and the direction that he provided. And what you're seeing right here is the average of all the judges' scores for each one, and the highest one in each criterion bolded, right? So you can see how these things perform. Now, that's just the numeric point tally, but that is not necessarily directly correlated to how Chris and the other judges made their picks, right? So like what you may see here just in the slide that you're showing is that the PX3-PRO had the highest score for color accuracy and skin tone, and in SDR mode, it was also the judge's pick for the darkroom viewing, right? Even though it was brighter than some other projectors like their PT1, right? So all of this stuff is really just here to provide to the viewer or the reader of Phil and our content, some context about like how these things stacked up against each other. But then if you scroll back to the top of the card, that's really where you get into the picks. And each judge was tasked with choosing 1, 2, and 3 of their choices for each of those 4 groups: best value, mixed room, dedicated theater, overall. And for a judge to pick something as number 1, that gave it 3 points. If they picked it as number 2, it got 2 points, and if they picked it as third, it got 1 point. So similar rank. Instead of asking them to give points, we say just pick placement. We'll do the math after the fact, right? And if you go back to the top, you're able to see the ranking for each of those, but we're also detailing the points. So you can get some context about the differences between first place and second place and third place. So it's not that everything was just one step behind, right? So, to talk about best value, here's like a great example, right? So the PX3-PRO got number 1 for best value. But what you also see with the L9Q is it got number 1 for everything else, right? So yes, to Phil's analogy, the L9Q would be the Ferrari in this case, but the PX3-PRO was an awesome WRX, right? The bang for the buck was there.
Right.
And then as you can see here, the 2 other items that the judges selected for best value pick were the JM Go and the X Jimmy Aura, right? Now these were items that, they didn't win in placement in many of the other criteria. I mean, the JM Go came in, third place for the mixed room use, but their price point and the feature set that they had and the overall performance is what I'm interpreting that the judges selected, right? So I can't speak for the judges. Chris will be able to give far more insight into, what the mindset was. But it's interesting. The PX3-PRO was a pretty overwhelming choice, when it came to the judges' decisions, with 12 points, for that best value pick.
So Chris, why do you guys think you picked that? A lot of people picked the. I have an idea, but why do you think a lot of people picked the PX3-PRO over the other guys there? Because some of them were less expensive still.
Yeah, I think it was its overall performance. It didn't do anything poorly. It did everything well, some things exceptionally well. I think actually even the less expensive PT1 did a little bit better on things like Ultimate Black Level. But that's something that was common, I think, to all 3 of the Hisenses, that the black levels were rich, they're deep, and that's something that speaks to me a lot. I love OLED TVs, certainly more than LCD, LED LCD TVs, because of those black levels, the ability to watch, text scrolling on a dark background without seeing haloing and things like that. But on a projector, it's really hard to capture a black level, particularly when it's projecting on a white screen, right? So the lowest black that you have is actually white, but in a dark room without anything projecting on that white screen, it does look black. And I think that the Hisense ones just overall were the best performers for that. And I think because the Hisense PX3-PRO is half the price of the L9Q, it makes it a better pick overall, in my opinion. Well, the big spend $6,000 on a projector.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, you got to remember, you got to factor this in too. The PX3 won it last year. So that'd be like you walking into a dealership and saying, here's the 2016 911, but I got this brand new, unused Boxster S Sport race package that now it used to sell for this much money.
Right.
Now the new models, then it's selling for this much money.
Yeah.
The value on that is huge. So that
Yep.
product, that piece now is $700-800 less than what it was competing last year. So
Right.
so now you're getting, pretty much near last year's flagship performance at
Right.
at really approachable price points, which is
Right. And
why that
every
unit
display is every display is a moving target because, since it won last year, it's had firmware updates. It's actually gotten better.
Thank you,
yeah, it
Chris.
has
Yeah.
gotten better.
And the 4 movie is another example of that. It was noticeably better in color accuracy than it was last year, even though it did do well last year. But I think the PX3 Pro has maybe had an even bigger improvement because it was super impressive on lots of different content, particularly shadow detail and black levels.
Yeah, so I just want to chime in on Chris's point about the firmware, right? So, the JM Go and the X Jimmy, which did get picks in terms of value, this is their native firmware that was out here right now, right? So to Chris's point, the PX3 Pro is mature. It's had many different firmware updates, many different improvements, while the JM Go and the X Jimmy, were still native. There's some kinks to be worked out, but despite, and they are going to be worked out, and it's only going to get better from here, right? But it just goes to show that the it's not just a hardware game, right? There's a
Right.
software game to it also, right? And it
Correct.
makes a big difference, and even the L9Q has had, even though it's only been out for less than 6 months, I believe at this point right now, it's gone through 3 different firmware revisions, primarily addressing the HDR curve, as Phil attested to before, and really enhanced how it handles the shadow detail and low light contrast, despite not having the highest native contrast out of the bunch. Coupled with almost the highest amount of horsepower under the hood, right behind the QS100.
Yeah, and I think to parallel this with the flat panel world, there was another event that compared the top OLED TVs to each other earlier this year, and I think one of the competitors, the LG in particular, had some issues that were clearly software and firmware related that impacted its overall score. Since that event, it's gotten better, but you can't go back and do it over again. Right? The event happens at that time, and the scores reflect how it performed at that time.
Now, OLED is a perfect example. The panels all come from the same person. The panel probably came from the guy that had the firmware problem, right?
Right. There's 2. There's the LG panels and the Samsung panels, and all 4 of the top OLEDs use 1 or 2 of the.
Exactly. So that's an example of how you can't just go do an ANSI checkerboard test pattern and a color sweep and say, oh, they're the same. It's how you utilize. Utilize that is really, which is why I love this exercise.
Yeah, software makes a huge difference.
So I want to go back to the scoring method because I think your scoring system was a little bit different than other comparison shootouts. So you said each judge ranked what they saw from like 1 through 8 of the.
No, I guess Brian can probably speak to this best.
Actually, I can go to the judge. We'll do the basic judging first, right? First thing, we wanted to have people understand the strengths and weaknesses of each product and where that they excel, because people have different needs and wants, right? Some people are their main focus is a bat cave and great sound, whatever whatever your focus is. So what we did was we graded different categories. How does it look in HDR? How does it look in SDR? All the way down. Then we said, okay, what are the kind of things that make a good SDR picture, right? And we broke those down into a couple of categories. What makes a great HDR picture? And then we wrote those down. Well, the way I explained it to it was thinking if you're a teacher and a 10 is an A++, a 100%. We're grading on a curve, right? The answer key we're going to try to use is something like the OLED, right? When it talks about black levels, highlight detail, specular highlights, because it's got enough brightness, the tone mapping is less aggressive. That's going to be closer to the answer key. And no one's gonna get 100%, right? But which one we're grading on a curve? The best one got maybe a 10 or a 9, and then everybody else worked their way down. That allows the person to see how these things ranked and things like you said, install flexibility, how sharp is the image, things like that. The other thing was, okay, factoring at the end of the event, after everything you've seen, if your mom came up to you and said, give me 3 projectors that I would buy, that's a great value, what would you say based on what you care about and your perspective about what value is? And then that was consolidated to make those scores, right? And the same thing with if you were going to buy a projector for a dark room or your friend was going to buy one, which one would you recommend? So that's where it came through. So it wasn't now it's not about the points. It's about the perception of the product itself. Last year, before movie, everybody said, oh, the colors are way oversaturated, but half the people loved it and picked it as one of their favorites because, so it was more about this. So that's the difference. One is points as they're rated as a school teacher. And the next one is, if you were going to buy one, what would you get? And that's the difference between the different scores. So that's how they go together.
Yeah. So the two different scales, one was 0 to 10 for ultimate individual performance. And then like Brian said, they were aggregated into an overall scorecard to see which projector did the best in each individual category. But the top ranking, those were 4 categories. They said, okay, Chris, which was your favorite 3 for best value? What were your favorite 3 for home theater? Favorite 3 for overall performance? And then those 6 judges' scores were then aggregated again and came up with this ranking system.
Yeah, and there was a 4th, 5th, 6th place, but we decided to only show the top 3. We're not trying to, denigrate anyone, in any fashion here.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Hisense kind of swept the competition. And they have really come into this category strong. How do you think they've been able to do this? Basically, over the last 2 years, they've won the last. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, they were the first ones. The first thing is the whole idea of a laser TV and sound and everything else. Everybody else is on maybe generation 1 or 2. They're in generation 5 or 6, right? So so when it comes to things like that, for example, tri-laser light sources, they're really good at them. Why? Because they've been using them forever. And they understand now the challenges of mapping something that can do Rec 2020 down to Rec 709. So your regular, so your Gone with the Wind doesn't look like a cartoon, right? So they understood, they're learning. So the level of experience there when it comes to video processing, tone mapping, ultra short throw lens, throw ratios, how to build a chassis so it's not noisy, all those things, that this comes from experience. And they have this huge head start. The next thing is investment. A lot of companies are doing 1 or 2 projectors. These guys are all in with the cards, right? They have multiple projectors that are ultra short throw. So not only are they heavily invested in it, they have the most experience. So of course they have this kind of a head start above everybody.
And the fascinating thing is they make 2 other models that come with the screen that are not in this competition. So,
and they're great.
So where do those fall within this spectrum of models?
Well, those are no longer being produced. So you're referring to like their bundle. So Hisense used to have this concept of, they coined the term laser TV, right? And the philosophy that they had in the years past was that you bought this projector and it came with a screen. You can't change the size of your TV, so you can't change the size of your laser TV, right? I had been telling them for a while, I don't know if that's the right philosophy. I think making the screen accessible is the right thing to do, but not necessarily fix people into something that they have no chance to change, when everyone else is doing that. So when the PX3, it was the PX2-PRO maybe was the first one, the PX1-PRO. I'm losing track. But they
laser
no
cinema.
Longer,
they
now have all of their stuff which is variable focus, which will support multiple image sizes. They do offer screens as an optional bundle, but it's no longer a forced requirement. And and you asked about how Hisense has made such changes over the past 2 years, right? So this is our 4th year hosting, the UST Showdown, and the PX3-PRO, which won last year in many ways, was a huge leap forward in terms of performance over the previous generations. Hisense was able to triple the native contrast. They, have better job tone mapping. I mean, it was a sea change, in that iteration, and they've just continued to progress upon it and carry it forward.
Right. So, I mean, we haven't really talked about the winner, the Hisense, the L9Q, but let's get
Is it the winner?
One.
Yeah,
it did do well in 3 categories,
right.
There's no one winner. They're all great projectors.
They're all great projectors, but like I said, that was pretty much the most expensive projector there.
Right.
And the goal was Hisense is trying to move the goalposts as far as they possibly can and
Right.
say, okay, we're
Mhm.
going to build a projector it's more expensive, but if you want
Yeah.
the best, this is what we believe is the best right now. Now,
Right.
the big thing that came across that is quality brightness combined with great processing is king, right? Because
Yeah.
and that is what happens. The people say, well, there are words of projectors. If I play the Batman, the darkest scene in the Batman, those had better black levels, right? But that happens in HDR every once in a while. A lot of HDR is Furiosa. It's bright, vibrant things, right? And brighter colors appear displayed at higher luminances, appear more saturated. You can apply less aggressive tone mapping. You can have higher specular highlights. You can have highlight detail and a higher average frame level or on-screen brightness. So all of a sudden, having all of that brightness just elevates it. So even if you want a dedicated theater, unless you're watching Vengeance, because I Am Vengeance from Batman, the one scene that we use, or the guy climbing up the stairs, 1917, and that's all you watch. The majority of the content that when you fired up on that L9Q with HDR from Star Wars to everything else, it was just dazzling, right?
Yeah.
Mixed use, enough light to combat ambient light. And if I need something that does great theater and great ambient light, guess what's going to win the overall? Or
Yeah.
guess is going to
Yep.
be the top pick for the overall. So what were you going to say,
And
Brian?
I was just going to mention too, I think there was, from myself as well as I think many of the judges and even potentially Phil, is that there was some expectation of certain models being being favored with that Batman scene or the 1917 scene, right? But and if you saw it in isolation, right, that projector by itself, you may have thought it was like absolutely amazing. But even in those scenes, using like the PT1 as a reference, which is really great in that, when it was right next to the L9Q, the PX3-PRO, the 4 movie, the
Yeah.
Epson, and all these other
Yeah.
things, the judges still lean towards the brighter image,
Right.
even when they were evaluating those things. Now, Chris will certainly be able to speak more to what he saw and what he chose. I'm not inside of his head, but when I look at the data, right, and I'm reading the numbers and I'm geeking out with my pivot tables and I'm talking to the judges, that's really kind of the conclusion I drew, is that brightness is better even in a dark room as a result of what I gleaned from the data here.
So
Yeah,
Chris, what do
because
you
it
think?
helps the image to pop. I mean, the black levels are the canvas on which the image is painted, but the brightness is the vibrancy of the overall color and the bright points of the screen and what makes it look dynamic and almost three-dimensional. So you need the black levels, of course, but on most content, like Phil said, you're not just looking at the Riddler hiding in the background of the Batman in the when he comes to assassinate the mayor. Oops, sorry, spoiler alert. You're looking at a lot of different content, and we do tend to focus and obsess over these individual scenes that are really hard to reproduce accurately. But it shows you, it highlights those areas of performance that are really hard to attain. I think honestly, this is not fluff. I could live with any one of the ones on this list. Epson is great in a bright room. The JM Go O2S was amazing in that you can just sit it next to a wall, press a few buttons. It'll compensate for paint color on the wall. It'll compensate for warping on the wall. It's just automatic. It gives you this geometrically perfect image on a crappy old wall. We did it at the event after the event was over. 150-inch screen, like nobody's business. So it really does depend on what you want this projector to do. I made a joke earlier. Was the L9Q the best? Yes, in performance, it definitely was, and I agree with that. But it's not the best for everybody.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
really good at what it does, and overall awesome performer. But if you want to be able to bring this thing to your friend's house, then get the JM2 JM Go O2S, because it comes with a carrying case and it's light and it's bright and it's affordable. So
I was trying to
again, it
hustle.
depends on the use case.
Yeah, I was trying to talk Brian and let me take the JMGO
back on the
on
plane with you, right?
in my carry on. That's how small it
Yeah.
is. In the case, it's small enough to put in the carry on an airplane. Come on, right? And the sound was really good, and it's 3600, and it was bright. That 3600 is it's a great light source. So it's a great piece.
Yeah.
So all
So
of
I
these,
think
even the,
perspective, yeah.
mm,
Sorry,
yeah,
prospective buyers just really need to drill down on this. Look
yeah,
at the individual performance
yeah,
categories, figure out what we're going to do with it,
yeah,
and I think they'd be happy with any one
yeah,
of these.
yeah. Because
Well,
if you look
I'm
at the
going to throw one
XJB,
more.
I'm sorry, I was going to look at the
Please, you go,
XJB.
Phil. No,
Two thousand
I'll let you.
dollars, $2,000
Yeah,
for the
that's
XJB. It
crazy.
looked really
Yeah.
good, and it was
Mhm.
beautiful. It's what we called. It
Yeah.
had the highest spouse approval factor of all of them. It looked like a work of art,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, the
So
L9Q is a beast. It's huge and heavy. It is.
Well, I just like to mention, right? So you obviously could look at the scorecard and you can see what the judges thought. You could see all the points, but I kind of want to emphasize to people that are like learning about this or getting into this that it's, projection, specifically with UST, it's not just a one-piece system. It's not just a projector, right?
mhm,
So you're going to take into effect, into account the size of the image you're trying to produce, right? The larger the image, the more light you're going to need, right? What's your seating configuration? That will help determine what the right screen to use is, whether you go with a lower gain lenticular that has a wider viewing angle that's going to give you a better black level, but bring the white down accordingly to maintain the contrast, or you go with the higher gain Fresnel screen, which will brighten the image, but you have a much more narrow viewing angle. And things such as like the L9Q, which is the hot topic, so we'll continue to talk about it, right? It may have a higher black floor than some of the other items, right? And if you're looking at everything at 100 inches, you're going to notice that. But let's say you want to make a 150-inch image, right? You can scale that L9Q to 150 inches and still have a very bright image, right? Your total amount of foot lamberts is going to
mhm,
be large. And as you make that image larger, the black floor reading is going to go down. So your black level is going to look better, right? Now, if you took something like the PT1 that already has a lower black floor and you expanded it to 150, yeah, the black floor goes down with that too, but so does the overall brightness,
mhm,
right? So then perhaps even though that may be a great projector for you at a smaller screen size
mhm,
and on a Fresnel screen,
mhm,
may not be right for you if you're trying to go 150. So it is a recipe of all sorts of factors that
yeah,
are involved.
yeah,
And fortunately, there's great informational websites such as ecoustic and projector reviews and
mhm,
great resources at
mhm,
projectorscreen.com that can help answer questions and make
mhm.
people or assist people with finding the right combination of components to deliver or exceed the expectation that they have as they're looking to get into projection.
And
Exactly.
on
So
that note,
on that
Brian, I think we
note,
need to wrap this up.
Okay.
yeah,
Well, there's
let's
one more thing I want to say before we go, because people are
Okay.
going to ask,
okay.
why didn't you test this and why didn't you test that? All right. So, for example, motion. Where's the motion? Well, we tested motion and they all look the same. So
Pretty
it was
much.
like
Yeah.
they pretty much looked the same. Either you could turn off the mimic or you could put it in film mode, you could put it in 24p. And when we played the stuff, the difference was so negligible that we were like, okay, do we need to put it in here? Right. Now, of course, we would love to have tested all of the sound features and the sound quality of each one and the responsiveness of the user interface and all of the setup features, but we only had one day. Chris will tell you that you could probably spend a day just doing the audio comparisons.
We
So
did 2 years
so
ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
you did
exactly.
spend the
So
day.
exactly.
Mhm.
So while we just wanted today just kind of focus on the picture quality things and the stuff that we saw that there was some applicable, noticeable differences, or this chart would have been insane, and we would have been there till we'd still be in there having this call from Brian's Bat Cave right now. All right. So I just want to let you know that we know that you could have tested for more, but we try to do as much as we can in an 8 to 9 hour period. Okay.
Well, I mean, you guys, I mean, you did an incredible job. It's a thankless job. Like the amount of time you spend setting this up, organizing it. It's just unbelievable. We thank you for your dedication to this industry and for helping customers and consumers and shoppers find what they're looking for. And I think that's kind of what we learned. There are um, strengths and weaknesses of every model. But if you want to pay for the best, or you guys have outlined that in the showdown with all the scores. And I want to point everyone to projectorscreen.com. They have a full write up of the event, all the other details, including the screens that were used and the switchers and everything involved. And we also have a full report from Chris Boylan on ecoustics.com. So I encourage you to look in our show notes for that. And I want to thank Brian Gluck from projectorscreen.com for all his work in setting this up, and Phil Jones from projectorreviews.com. Amazing. We're incredibly grateful, and we hope to see everyone next time. Thanks.